Well, welcome everyone, members, guests, ladies and gentlemen. So lovely to see you here in person. It's kind of a new experience for most of us, I think, or a novel experience, shall I say. And it's great to have Irina here, Professor Irina Filatova, who's going to address us this evening. Just before we get on to that, I would like to, I've got a couple of housekeeping notes. Just about our next meeting on the 1st of June, we're going to have Trudy Hartzenberg of TRALAC, the Trade Law Center, talking about the African Continental Free Trade Area, which may well be very interesting. So I hope you'll make a note of that. And Pip has asked me to remind you, if you haven't paid your membership fees, please to speak to her and she'll organize everything. And can I encourage any guests here that aren't members yet to join us as well. And now we can revert to the topic in hand. I think we've all been horrified by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the resultant war. Night after night, our TV screens highlight all the horrors of war, the alleged atrocities and war crimes committed against innocent civilians. We find it hard to understand how Russia can justify marching into a sovereign nation with a democratically elected government with a view to taking over. In the meantime, NATO, the EU, the US, and the UK wring their hands, send support to Ukraine, impose sanctions on Russia, which seem to escalate every week as the war drags on. Thank goodness Professor Irina Filatova is here to help us make sense of it all.
Settle everything.
And just a short bio on Irina. She received her degrees at Moscow State University and ultimately finished her tenure there as professor and head of the Department of History. From 2004 to this year, she was visiting professor at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. She also became director of the School of Social Sciences at the University of Durban-Westville. She specializes in the history of ties between Russia and South Africa. She's the author of 6 books, apparently another one's on the way, and on this and related subjects, as well as a myriad of articles and papers. I'll give you Irina Filatova.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sheila. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's very nice to see you all in life and not on screen. And I must start by saying that it's not an easy talk for me for several reasons. First of all, let me start by saying that I'm Russian, but it is not the war in my name. And that I'm utterly shattered by what is going on in Ukraine and deeply sympathized with the Ukrainians. I'm devastated also by what is going on in Russia and with the Russians, whichever angle you look at it. But emotions aside, it is very important to understand this war, because I'm sure that this is a watershed moment, not only for Ukraine and Russia, but for the whole world in every possible sense. The first obvious question is why? Why did Russia start it? And what does it want to achieve by it? There are proclaimed reasons and goals of this war, and understood or implied reasons and goals. They differ. Let's start with the proclaimed ones. According to Putin, the main goal of the war is to protect the Russian speakers in Ukraine and to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. For these purposes, Ukraine had to be demilitarized and denazified. This, in turn, was necessary because of Russia's concern for its security as a result of the enlargement of NATO. Last December, Putin sent an ultimatum to the United States and NATO, demanding NATO withdraws from the territory of its East European members. Putin considered the reply, i.e. the offer, to return to the discussions about strategic weapons in Europe, inadequate. The war was his reply. What were the implied goals of the war. He knew full well that in effect he was demanding NATO's self-dissolution. He knew that if the United States and NATO showed even the tiniest sign of an inclination to accommodate his demands, both would be dead or weakened beyond recognition. Such a wobble would have been particularly damaging in view of Trump's cavalier attitude towards his NATO allies and America's chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. When NATO and the United States made no concessions, Putin raised the stakes by starting war. Thus, the implied main goal of the war has been the significant weakening or even the destruction of NATO by demonstrating its impotence. Putin started the war not with Ukraine. This was just a side issue for him. He started the war with the so-called the collective West. The weakening of the West would have changed the global balance of power and ushered in a new global world order, divided into spheres of influence based on military might, and that alone. The implied meaning of the second goal, demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, is usually understood as the toppling of, first of all, as the liquidation of Ukraine as an independent state, either by incorporating its territory into Russia or by toppling its government and creating the government controlled by Moscow and ready to bow to all its demands and wishes. However, the real meaning of both these euphemisms deserve to be looked at more closely. Already, the first 2 weeks of the war showed that demilitarization meant the destruction and not just of military targets, but also of cities, towns, and villages, with all what was there: clinics, hospitals, cultural objects, the physical infrastructure, and it also meant thousands and thousands of civilian deaths. Whatever you want to do with the occupied territory, to incorporate it into your own or to leave it with a compliant government, turning it into a wasteland just makes no sense. So why is Russians doing it? I think the term denazification, which is a puzzle to many, is in fact the key to understanding what is going on. Why does Putin assert that Ukraine is ruled by a Nazi regime? There are legitimate elections, multiple parties, open media, the normal processes for the transfer of power. But the Russian government never recognized the outcome of what transpired in Kiev in 2014, when the legitimately elected President Yanukovych reneged on his election promise to lead Ukraine into the European Union. He was overthrown by the uprising in which right-wing nationalist elements played a very visible and prominent role. But this coup or revolution, depending on who you're talking to, was supported by the majority of the population of Ukraine. There were attempted pro-Russian counter-revolts in the east, in some cases organized by the Russians from Russia. They succeeded only in the Crimea and Donbass. But despite their prominent role in 2014, the right-wing parties consistently do badly in elections. In the last elections, for example, they got 2%, and this is much lower than, for example, 2012, when they got 10%. So it was consistently going down. Russia's particular ire was directed against the Azov Regiment. This was a regiment formed of volunteers in 2014 to fight in Donbass against the separatists Donetsk and Lugansk, and it now is part of the Ukrainian National Guards. Its agenda is indeed a right-wing and nationalist, radical nationalist. But is Russia itself free of people who hold similar views. Certainly not, just as any other country, I suppose. So for Putin, the Ukrainian government is Nazi because of these right-wing elements. It turns out, however, that it is not just the government whom Russia deems to be Nazi. It is the majority of the population of Ukraine, irrespective of their language preferences, Ukrainian or Russian, or their right or left political inclinations. They are all those who want Ukraine to be independent from Russia. On 3rd March, Russian Information Agency, an official Russian information outlet, published an article titled, "What Russia Must Do with Ukraine." It finally explained what Russia means by denazification. According to the author, Ukraine as a national state is simply impossible because it has no civilizational content, unlike, for example, Georgia or the Baltic states. It is an artificial anti-Russian construct acting on behalf of the alien civilization. It makes Ukraine Nazi in the author's view. What makes Ukraine Nazi in the author's view is the desire for independence from Russia. Its aspiration to join the European Union and its willingness to defend its territorial integrity. Ukraine's Nazification, he writes, started in 1989 under Gorbachev, when Ukraine was given legal forms of political self-expression. So its denazification has to take at least a generation, and it can only be done by Russia and the Russians alone. During this time, those who fought against Russia, arms in hand, have to be executed. All authorities who worked for and in independent Ukraine, all personalities and institutions associated with Ukrainian national culture and education, all the elite, in other words, have to be filtrated, and many of them liquidated. The swamp, he writes, which passively supported independence by voting for Poroshenko or Zelensky, have to be filtrated and punished by bearing all the hardships of war and paying the Russians for it. Any sign of Ukraineness, such as language, music, dress, culture, literature, symbols, will have to be banned. Such understanding of denazification explains the ferocity with which the population of Bucha was treated. Representatives of the Ukrainian elite had their country houses there. It was an elite suburb. They, in Russia's view, were responsible for the Nazification of Ukraine. They had to be liquidated. This vision of denazification also explains the ferocity of the bombardments of eastern Ukraine. The author of this article writes about total Nazi terror against anti-fascists in Odessa, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, and Mariupol. This is again about 2014. Then the attempts of pro-Russian groups, anti-fascists, according to the author, to overthrow the local authorities, which remained loyal to Kiev, were suppressed by the locals. All these cities are mainly Russian-speaking, so their unwillingness to follow the example of Donbass and join pro-Russian forces is the cause of particular offense to the Russians. And Mariupol is not just a strategically important city for the Russians. It is also a symbol of the opposition of the mainly Russian city to the Russian rule. And it is also defended by the hated Azov Regiment. The remnants of it are still at the now famous Azov steelworks factory. According to witnesses, civilian population in occupied territories is now filtrated And all those who have any tattoos with any Ukrainian symbols or any pro-Ukrainian emails on their phones are classified as Nazis. Some are shot, some are taken to Donetsk and to the unknown fate. Do we know Putin's attitude to all that? I would like to speak a bit about the logic of Putin's Russian world, which is a Eurasianist notion. Putin never said anything about liquidations, but he said many a time, for the first time publicly, I think in 2007 to Bush Sr., that Ukraine is not and cannot be a state because it is Russia, and that Ukraine is not a nation because Ukrainians are Russians. This is now the official point of view, openly expressed, including, for example, in the State Duma, Russian Parliament State Duma Committee for Protection of State Sovereignty. I will not quote, but the idea is that Ukraine cannot have independence because it has never had it and it has never been a sovereign nation. From a Soviet communist, Putin has evolved into a Russian Orthodox Christian nationalist, and from this into a Eurasianist. Eurasianism is an old trend in Russian philosophical thought. It appeared in the 1920s among the Russian emigres in Europe. Eurasians think not in terms of states, they think in terms of civilizations. Russia, they thought and think, was not a country and not an empire. It is a unique civilization based on territory and culture, geography and culture. It is distinct from both the European Romano-Germanic civilization and from Asia. Its historic role is to be the center of power on the European continent and in parts of Asia. Its characteristic features are an etatist economy, militarized autocracy, religious spirituality, and autarky. Eurasianism sees itself as exact opposite of institutionalized liberal democracy and the culture of individual rights and freedoms. For them, Romano-Germanic and Anglo-Saxon worlds, or the collective West, as Putin calls it, are mortal enemies of Eurasia or of the Russian world, incomparably more dangerous for it than the Asian world. Eurasia, according to the believers in this doctrine, is supposed to be a militarized theocracy ruled by a leader and his chosen few who are selected from the most loyal to him personally and to the idea. The population is supposed to be disciplined and totally united around the leader and the idea. Putin reads and promotes Eurasianists, particularly Ivan Ilyin. One of Ilyin's ideas was that a desire of a part of a nation to separate from the whole is akin to a wish of a cell to separate from the body. Probably for Putin, Ukraine is just such a cell. I did not see Putin ever quoting and mentioning another Eurasianist, our contemporary Alexander Dugin. He's Ilyin's more aggressive ideological heir, and Putin doesn't quote it perhaps because Dugin was a founding member and for a number of years leader of a fascist National Bolshevik Party, which existed in Russia in 1993, 2007. He left it in 1997 to lead the Russian Eurasianist movement. That party was based on withering hatred of the anti-human triad of liberalism, democracy, and capitalism, and aimed at building, I quote, an empire from Vladivostok to the Gibraltar on the basis of Russian civilization, just, traditionalist, and hierarchical. The party was banned as extremist in Russia, But Dugin is now head of the Russian Eurasianist movement and a respected and popular philosopher. Putin may not have quoted Dugin, but Dugin boasts in interviews publicly that Putin is implementing Dugin's agenda, only in Dugin's view, very slowly. He spoke of the need to incorporate the Crimea long before 2014. He has advocated the occupation of Ukraine and the creation of Russian Eurasia from Dublin to Vladivostok since 2014. Russia would not need to occupy all these territories, enough for them to be Finlandized. Eurasianists, Putin among them, see themselves as defenders of traditional values, not just in Russia, but in the whole world, against the domination of the rotten and depraved West. In their view, liberalism is actually as good as dead, and authoritarianism, which is the future, is already on the march. Serious Russian academics discuss this in seminars and long papers and lectures. Russian propaganda repeats over and over again that for Russia, this war is existential, eschatological, and civilizational. With such a vision, I can see that Russia will never question of why Putin started the war now. It is actually quite obvious. Ukraine seemed absolutely tantalizingly weak and divided. Its leadership divided and full of pro-Russian elements and Russian spies, even in security services and the military. Its army was small and ill-equipped. The Russians knew that Ukraine was buying hardly any new weapons, equipment, and military technology. And yet they also knew that NATO was training the Ukrainian armed forces. So why wait until they are fully trained? Europe seemed to be in tatters. It was weak and divided, and European economy has barely survived COVID and the public lockdowns. Each of the present leaders' position in Putin's view was precarious, and not only in Putin's view, of course. In Germany, powerful Merkel, the only European politician whom Putin respected, was gone. Now it had an unreliable coalition government with weak Olaf Scholz at the head. In France, Macron perceived as extremely weak and also facing elections. Hungary's Orban, a close friend. Britain's Johnson, staggering from crisis to crisis. West Europeans are not enamored with the undemocratic practices in EU's East European members. And they all, but particularly Germany, by courtesy of Angela Merkel, depended on Russian oil and gas almost completely. Many European politicians have been bribed. Russian big business has become deeply entrenched in the European financial and economic institutions, and Russia today was active and popular in Europe. Even the arch enemy, the United States, is in disarray, divided as never before since the Civil War, much more isolationist, courtesy President Trump. Biden is old, weak, and according to the Russian propaganda, ill, and his vice president incompetent. The American economy is depressed, and inflation is going through the roof. And Russia has friends all over the world. The mighty China, India, Venezuela, Brazil, South Africa, and other African countries, the majority of the global population. There were internal reasons too. Before February, Putin's ratings were at their lowest, 54% approval rating. And the population, tired of the pandemic and lockdowns and crumbling economy, started to get restive. The incorporation of the Crimea helped in 2014. So the incorporation of Ukraine should have helped, and it did. And everything was ready. The opposition was crushed, media sphere cleansed, The new constitution adopted, new restrictive laws passed, the Duma turned into a rubber stamp, prison space extended. Finally, personal. Putin must be feeling his age. He will be turning 70 in October, and he must be thinking about the future. The incorporation of Ukraine would be a wonderful present, crowning achievement for such an anniversary. And that is some legacy to leave to his ideological heirs. Well, this did not go according to plan. Now, Putin's plans. I shall not go in any details here because we all know it from the news. Plan A have been discussed over and over and over in all the media, and we know that it was from the landing at Gostomel airport and to the parade in the Kiev's main street and so on. And we all know the reasons why it did not work. According to this plan, the Ukrainian army would be easily suppressed. The Russian population gladly accepted and supported the Russian troops. Ukrainians would be demoralized, but finally accept and get used to the new order. Whoever opposed would be cleansed. The National Guards accompanied the first echelon of the Russian army exactly for this purpose. But I think it is worth mentioning that to the Russians, the reaction of the collective West to their advance in Ukraine has been the best proof of the fact that the Russians, are indeed fighting the collective West, and that they are indeed fighting for the survival of their civilization and for the liberation of the whole world from the domination of the perfidious West. And that if it were not for the West pushing and pulling the Ukrainians to fight, they would have surrendered a long time ago. Plan B to occupy Donbass, which is happening now, and Plan C, which was announced by General Rustami Yankov just a few days ago, to occupy the whole of Ukrainian Black Sea coast and to get to Transnistria, which is pro-Russian separatist part of Moldova, where he said the Russian speakers are treated badly, the usual excuse for the invasion. This is a potentially very dangerous development, not only for Ukraine, but for Moldova, for Transnistria itself, and for the whole Europe. It is very difficult to achieve because Russian troops in Transnistria are number just 1,000, and to get there by land would be extremely difficult. They will have to go through well-defended Odessa and so on. But if they manage to get more Russian troops there, then it will be a different matter whatsoever. Just after Minenkaev's announcement, there were several explosions in Tiraspol, Transnistria's capital. The Ukrainians claim that this was a Russian provocation. The Russians blame the Ukrainians, and this could lead to the either opening of a second front in Ukraine or to the Russian intervention in Moldova, yet another country which now has a pro-European, pro-EU government, but no protection from either NATO or the European Union. There could be a number of other plans. They could emerge depending on the developments. Now to consequences. The consequences of the war are enormous, global consequences. We do not know the outcome of the war, but it is already obvious that Putin achieved one of his goals. He wanted to divide the world into spheres of influence or civilizations. He had achieved this, at least in Europe. The question is now where the border will be between these spheres and how the rest of the world will be aligned, even if vaguely. Of course, there will be more spheres of centers of power and spheres of influence or civilizations, whatever you want. First of all, around China, of course. It is also obvious that Putin has already proven to the world that might is indeed right, allowing you to do what you please. Whether he achieves his goals in Ukraine or not, the new global order is bound to be more dangerous, fraught with conflict, big and small, and much more militarized, and nobody is going to repeat Ukraine's mistake of denuclearization. Whether we want it or not, the new global order will also be, or tend to be, less open, less democratic, less liberal, and less global. Security measures which Europe will have to take may produce the tendency to curb some civil liberties, some access to information, and some free speech, particularly in the countries which are in the direct line of fire, i.e. Eastern Europe. I'm not sure that all present-day institutions, international institutions, based on the present global order will survive the shock of this war. It is not clear, for example, what is going to happen to the United Nations Security Council and thus to the United Nations itself when one of its members is engaged in occupying one of the members of the United Nations. There is a question of China and Taiwan. This is the first question which many thought about. Will it somehow, Russia's intervention, encourage the Chinese attack on Taiwan? The way it is going, I doubt it. I think that it will rather make China think twice before it decides on this course of action. It could use other means of achieving their goals. The war has already had a dramatic effect on the global economy. Supply chains are already disrupted and are bound to remain so for a long time. They will have to be drastically restructured in accordance to the new realization of the need for self-sufficiency in every possible sphere. Commodity prices are already going through the roof, particularly oil and gas, and are bound to remain very high, at least for the next few years. And so are the price of fertilizers, wheat, sunflower oil, and so on and so on. So instead of the predicted post-pandemic boom, the world is getting very poor forecasts for economic growth. In Europe, just 0.2, with the inflation 7%. It may result, in fact, in stagflation, the worst scenario of a combination of inflation and stagnation. For Europe, much depends on where the war ends. If Ukraine is defeated, European countries will exist in the shadow of an aggressive hostile neighbor, which can attack them on a whim. If Russia is defeated, Europe will end up having to feed and accommodate not only millions of refugees, but a whole devastated country, and then help to rebuild it. If the war ends in limbo, for example, with a rump Ukraine suing for peace, Europe will have to live with both of the above. Europe is now deciding how to wean itself of the dependence from Ukrainian oil and gas, whichever form it takes. It's going to be sorry.
Russian oil.
Yeah, Russian oil and gas. Whichever way it's going to be, it's a torturous process. It remains to be seen how much Europe will have to spend on helping Ukraine, but according to some calculations, it will be something to the tune of 7 billion euros a month. The need to assist Ukrainians and Ukraine in combination with stagflation, rising prices, high military spending, and new security measures is bound to produce public discontent, whichever form it takes. Such discontent is exactly what Putin is counting on. He has said many a time that Russia can withstand any sanctions and hardships, in part because of the patience and adaptability of the Russian population. The Europeans, in his view, are spoiled by high standards of living and are not used to tolerating a government which brings them inconvenience and discomfort. So they would get rid of Ukrainian problems. They would get tired of Ukrainian problems and change their government and leave Ukraine to its fate. For the moment, the war has given the new relevance to the present leaders, but for how long? The United States, it's true that there are problems about the United States too. According to the recent polls, a high proportion of Americans support assistance to Ukraine. In geopolitical terms, the United States is benefiting from the war. It may even create more jobs through the military industry and military technology of every kind. But in the long run, whole problems, divisions, elections, etc., as well as the isolationist tendencies will outweigh the importance of onerous European problems. I shall not even touch on Ukraine's problems. They are so obvious that I would not even dwell on how Ukraine, even with the assistance of the whole world, is going to cope with them. Maybe Zvinka will tell us. But Russia, the disaster that Russia brought on itself is absolutely mind-boggling to me. Sanctions will start to bite, even if Russians will bear all the hardships. And even if they blame these hardships on the West and not on Putin. Russia's technological progress, already bogged down, will slow to a stop. Even if Russia closes its borders, a brain drain is inevitable. Russia will find new markets for its precious resources, but it will require time and will not. Nothing will return to the golden era of pipelines into Europe, as no buyer will ever put itself in a position of dependence from Russian supplies. Russia will lag behind and risks to turn itself into China's raw material advantage. If Russia incorporates even part of the occupied territories, it will get ruined cities, devastated fields, a very angry and hungry population, millions of it. It will also get guerrilla movements, subversion, crime, armed gangs, and not only in Ukraine, but in Russia too. All of this was totally unnecessary. It is worse than a crime. It is a mistake, as Joseph Fouché once said. I don't know whether I should speak about South Africa. Maybe if you are interested, I can answer the questions.
Yeah, please do.
Okay. Well, finally, South Africa. I'm not surprised at all by South Africa's support for Russia. Russia, and not Ukraine, is associated with Soviet assistance to the ANC. The cadres knew perfectly well that even if they started in Ukraine, the policy was defined and made in Moscow. It is also obvious that the leadership of the ANC thinks in terms of their electorate, and their electorate is not on the side of Ukraine. It too, like Russians, sees the war as fight against the domination of the detested collective West. Just as many other African countries, South Africa has long complained about the present global world order, which it thinks unfairly skewed in favor of the developed nations. The list of grievances is long indeed. The refusal of the United States to join the International Criminal Court, unfair trade practices, Western intervention in Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Yugoslavia, and much more. Whatever may be wrong with Russia, it is fighting against the domination of the collective West, which means it must be doing the right thing. What the war will bring to South Africa is more or less clear. Skyrocketing fuel and gas prices, inflate food prices, more expensive electricity, broken supply chains, and logistic problems. And yet, if South Africa plays its cards wisely and cleverly, it can benefit from the war. Restructuring of its agriculture to accommodate the deficit. Using profits from high commodity prices for restructuring. Liberating the potential of green energy and much more. There will be less money for aid from Europe and perhaps less investment and less income for the tourist industry. But South Africa has its own intellectual and other capital. If it uses it properly, it can be fun. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irina, for a very enlightening address. And I'm sure people have questions in the audience. I can see John Matheson made copious notes during your, so, right. And then the gentleman over there, sorry, I can't quite see you. Yeah, okay, let's start with you. John, so you go ahead.
Thanks very much, Irina. I appreciated all the gaps you filled in my knowledge. I didn't disagree with any of it, but it left me only with hard questions. So I have three. The first is on the South African issue. What do you make of Cyril Ramaphosa's own attitude? Because when he came to power, he of course blocked the nuclear deal and cooled things with Putin a little bit. But do you think he's really all in on the policy, or do you think he's bowing to ANC pressure? The second question I have is all the things you explained about the civilization issue make perfect sense to me, but I wonder if there isn't also a strategic issue that people understate, and that is the importance of Crimea, of Sevastopol, and so on, for Russia's access to the Mediterranean Sea. It seems to me that, besides the civilizational and philosophical issues, that's a rather more practical one. And then my third point is about the UK. How do you read the UK now, with the Foreign Secretary saying that that we're going to take back every inch of Ukraine, and the American Defense Secretary saying we want to permanently weaken Russia, and increasing the budget from 3 billion to 33 billion, which suggests and some of the talk of Boris Johnson channeling his long desired inner Churchill, that they really think that they can actually push Russia out of Ukraine altogether.
Irina, I think we'll take question by question. It's
Okay.
easier logistically with the computer. Okay, could you go ahead?
Okay. Look, Ramaphosa's attitude. Ramaphosa dithers on every single political issue, and he dithers on this issue as well, obviously. It is difficult to judge whether it is just a very weak politician, or he is trying to reconcile various sections within his party, because I'm sure that not all of the ANC supports the present line of the government. They are uneasy about it. He doesn't want to preside over the split in the ANC, that's quite obvious. But the fact that he is weak enough to, or rather not strong enough to just put his hand down if he wanted to, that is also obvious. Now, whether it's civilization or strategy, I don't see why Russia could not have an access to the Mediterranean in the circumstances in which they were. You can coexist peacefully with the neighboring countries and have any access or exit wherever you want to. There's no problem about it. If you want the military control of it, it's a different matter whatsoever. And I do not accept the strategic view that, if it were not the enlargement of NATO, Russia would not have done what it is doing. It is totally unacceptable because it has made its situation much worse now strategically. If you occupy Ukraine, you are right on the border of NATO. You have made yourself closer to NATO, and you have scared your neighbors to such an extent that now even Finland is trying to join NATO. So no, I don't agree with that. I think that this has got no real strategic thinking, and if it is strategic thinking, I think it's a very stupid strategic thinking. Take back every inch, and whether it is possible to do it or not. It's extremely difficult to do, extremely difficult. I don't know whether it will be possible or not. But as I said before, if the war stops where it is now, Putin will never stop.
Thank you, Irina. The gentleman over there, can you take the, just while the computer's moving, I recall being in Sevastopol in 2013, where the Russian fleet was based. Admiralty House was pointed out to us on a nice promontory at the harbour. All the Russian fleet were in the harbour, and the, what are they called? Anyway, it was clearly there, and the Ukrainians were all thrilled that they were there because they were boosting the economy of Sevastopol. So there was no talk against it. Sorry, the gentleman over there, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, good evening. My name is George Conway. I don't represent anybody. I'm a self-employed professional.
Thank you. Please go ahead with your question.
First of all, let me begin by complimenting you and thanking you for a very insightful experience. I learned tonight something that I didn't know before. To my question, and actually early on, you two ladies had a very brief exchange, which was quite revealing and goes to the heart of the topic that I want to ask you about. You started to speak of Ukrainian oil, and then the lady but interrupted and said Russian oil. Now, to put it slightly differently, what we heard tonight was an expose of Putin's public notions of why he thinks his invasion is justified of Ukraine. But is it not a little bit like the grand thief who's never going to admit to being a thief and his biggest tribute wealth? What I'm referring to here are the oil reserves under the Sea of Azov. The world first became aware of these in 1812, 1813, where there was a prospect of tremendous reserves under the Sea of Azov and wrapping around the Crimea. Since then, it's been confirmed. These oil reserves are going to surpass by far the known reserves that were under the North Sea, which is the biggest bonanza known out. And they threaten to eclipse Russia's resources of oil in Siberia. Is the truth not perhaps that what we are witnessing now is the grandest act of thievery of this century, Putin and his entourage basically putting their mitts onto the oil reserves under the Sea of Azov? And everything around that is just basically a gloss to try and give it a cloak of respectability to the biggest theft of the century.
Well, thank you very much. I did not know about the reserves under the Azov Sea, but it makes absolute sense what you are saying, because Putin has decided to turn Russia into the energy superpower. And he has been doing everything everything possible to achieve exactly that. So it does make sense. It does make sense, yes. But he's already in control of the Azov Sea. So I don't, again, what is the problem there? Do you want to get the control over around Black Sea as well for that?
Well, it wraps around the whole of the Crimea.
Well, the whole of the Crimea they have got already.
And now even Romania is getting worried because they have claimed a small slice of these oil reserves which they are now threatened of being losing as well.
Well, it's not clear whether they are losing them or not. It's very difficult to judge. But yes, you are right. There may be these reserves in mind.
Thank you. Gentleman over here. Sorry, and then we'll come to you, Terry.
Hi, my name is Richard Stevenson. I'm here in my personal capacity. My first question, I'll just ask one question. It's a vast subject. And I think it touches, like you said, it's a global issue with supply chain disruptions. It's going to affect the European Union and so on. My question really is about the situation in Russia with the presidency of Vladimir Putin, and as you mentioned, his accelerating age. How long is he going to be in power? And is there an alternative political leader? Is there any opposition? Or has that iron grip authoritarianism spread throughout society and there's no hope except to see a prolonged war in the Ukraine and all the consequences that go with it? So is that inevitable, or is somebody going to step up and remove Mr. Putin?
Irina?
Right. Look, I don't know how long he's going to stay in power. It's really an impossible question. But about the opposition has been completely crushed. And Putin created a system which does not allow for anybody from outside of this system to come to power. So I can only foresee that somebody from his circle, if he will suddenly, die tomorrow, suddenly from somebody from his close circle, closest circle, who can control the power ministries, which is the FSB, the army, and so on, that person will occupy his place. Whether that person can be successful, that is a different matter, because at some point the country will explode. That's the whole Russian history for you. It is being, the screws are being tightened and tightened and tightened, and then the country explodes. So I do not see any liberal or softer forces suddenly coming to power through that system. I may be wrong. Gorbachev came to power, but
Is Medvedev out of the picture?
sorry.
Is Medvedev out of the picture for good?
Medvedev will not do anything. First of all, he is out of the picture for now. That's absolutely true. He is not in favor. He is nowhere. But he will not do anything, even if he were suddenly find himself as Russian president. He will not do anything, even in the slightest, that would upset Putin's circle. And what he was saying recently is sometimes much worse than what Putin was saying.
Oh, God. Well, that's pretty bad. Terry Crawford Brown is next on, and then you will come to you.
Thank you very much for fascinating. Numerous commentators from Henry Kissinger to Mearsheimer have over the years warned that it was a reckless proposition for NATO to move eastward 1 inch. There are 800 US military bases in Europe, Asia, Africa, targeted at Russia and China. And you referred to the Sevastopol naval base in Crimea, but of course that was meant to be handed over in 2017, which would then have become yet another military base, NATO base. And the British were building 2 navy bases in the Azov Sea. So Russia really does feel targeted by NATO and the US agenda for hegemony, financial and military, around the world. So Russia, I would suggest, is simply a preparatory step ahead of a war against China. Now, what I'm coming to is, if Russia retaliates tomorrow morning, for instance, by cutting off supplies of Russian gas to the European Union, the consequence may well be that the European Union will collapse itself economically. And you did refer to how long can the European determination to be sustained, whereas in Russia, as you say, it could go on forever. But what is the prospect now that we end up with someone hitting a nuclear button, either from Biden's standpoint or Putin's standpoint?
Well, I have not heard Biden threatening to press nuclear buttons.
Regime change.
We shall see, but so far I have never heard such threats. I heard them only from Putin. That is one point. The other point, let me repeat about this Russia being surrounded by nuclear bases, by NATO bases and so on. By doing what Putin is doing now, he makes it worse because he gets much closer to these bases, and he gets NATO much edgier. they are getting edgy. They are getting nervous, and there was absolutely no need for it. They lived happily and peacefully. Putin came to power in 2000. And nothing happened. Nobody attacked Russia. He was doing what he was doing in Georgia, in Kazakhstan, and wherever he wanted, and nobody intervened. So I don't see why the security worries, Putin's security worries for Russia are more justified than, say, Poland's or Romania's or even Hungary's. I don't see why. I haven't heard anybody threatening, anybody in NATO threatening using the nuclear weapons.
Terry, you wanted to follow up?
Yeah, and what I would suggest is, however, that what Eisenhower back in 1961 referred to as the military-industrial complex doesn't care how long this war goes on. In fact, the longer the better for the profits back in Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and so forth. So the consequences of the devastation of Ukraine, with disastrous consequences for Europe and Russia. And we have seen the consequences of American and NATO intervention in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Syria, with devastating consequences. And this is
sorry, what do you suggest? You suggest that nobody should have helped Ukraine. They actually let Russia do whatever it wants with Ukraine and with all its neighbors, and then it will be okay.
If I may, I'm actually the South African country coordinator for an American organization called World Beyond War.
Yeah.
And our first policy is to disband NATO, which has been closed down at the end of the Cold War, and the dismantlement of those 800 US bases.
Well,
Thank you, Terry.
I'm sorry.
I think you made your point. Sorry.
Let me answer the point about NATO. It would have been a very good point some years ago, but think about what would have happened with all these countries which are which are on Russia's borders now, if they were not protected by NATO. What would have happened to them? Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, my signature.
Yeah, are you ready? Is the computer ready?
I don't know.
Could you please introduce yourself?
I'll go and do better.
Thank you.
I might be quite naive here, but there are obviously two sides of the story. And I'm going to make some statements that I believe can potentially be true, maybe not exactly by you. Number one, when the Cubans, when the Russians put weapons in Cuba, the Cold War started. Then after that,
No.
well, you can say, I know all mainly, I think most of the things that I'm going to say, you may say no. I'll just make my statement. Secondly, the petrodollar was introduced. America went off the gold standard, they couldn't pay the debt. The petrodollar was used as a weaponizing the US dollar all over the world. Then coming back to Libya, we talk about countries like Saddam Hussein.
Where's the question?
No, I'm just giving.
Just give the guy a chance, please.
So what I'm saying is, at the time when Trump was in power, he had meetings with Putin and they would agree to start getting rid of nuclear weapons from both sides. After that, there was an agreement between Putin asked for NATO, or asked please, and we're talking about after the Minsk agreement, if you're prepared to move 150 kilometers away from the border, we will move 150 kilometers away. The Donbass region, we all know there were a lot of atrocities. Maybe it's not on CNN and BBC, but that's, I mean, you can read it if you go deeper into certain news channels. The voting, we are talking about NATO, who actually represents only 10% of the world population. 10%. Most of the people, it appears, that voted against Russia or stayed out of voting were people who are beholden to the IMF, the World Bank, and the American dollar. So a lot of discussions by ambassadors said this war could have been prevented. So all I'm saying is it could have been prevented if they listened to Putin's very basic demand: don't join NATO, don't bring weapons closer to the border. If Russia wanted to attack any countries, they could have attacked Baltic states many years ago. So my belief is it's not aggression from Russia, it's a response to them being pushed too far.
Thank you very much. Irina, would you like to react to that one?
Well, it is a point of view. I can say only one thing to that. That is, first of all, Cold War did not start with the Cuban crisis, Cuban Missile Crisis, first of all. Second, of course, NATO represents not the majority of the global population, and of course, there are very many people who do not like it, and I do not argue against the point of view, and I actually share it, that NATO intervened unnecessarily, often without any particular justified reason. That is also true, which does not mean that it was going to attack Russia. Which also does not mean that it was going to press the nuclear button. The last point about Donbass, and I saw Zvinka holding her hand, and I would like her to come here, but about Donbass, yes, there was a war in Donbass, absolutely. But Donbass is a separatist, and I know that about 12,000 people, official figure, were killed there. That is absolutely true on both sides, not on one side. Okay, I know that several villages were destroyed, but most of these areas are not destroyed, and the cities in the Donbass area have not been destroyed. Now, the situation is that there are separatist republics, right? Separatist states. If you remember what Russia has done with Chechnya when it tried to go separate, you would understand that possibly Russia treats separatists a bit harder and a bit harsher than Ukraine did. But look, again, it's a point of view.
Thank you. I can see, I had a hand here, and then Zvinka, we had quite a few hands, yes, but I saw the gentleman here first. So do you mind if Zvinka, we have her first? Right, will you go ahead?
Thanks a lot. I wanted to ask a question about the narrative that this war is against NATO, because as you know, Russian aggression is not just military, it's also the disinformation and cyber attacks.
Yes.
Do you think that this specific narrative is the disinformation that works in favor of Russia? That the war started not against the collective West or NATO, but simply to extend Russian access to natural resources and demography or generally population, Ukraine, and the narrative has changed because Ukraine actually stood back and fought against the Russian invasion. Just to went also to gentlemen, Ukraine was neutral according to the constitution and did not plan to have any military bases on its territory until Russian invasion in 2014. And the decision to join NATO only started after Russia has invaded.
Vinka, could you just introduce for the record, just say who you are? Thanks. Irina?
Look, Zinka, I don't think that Russia decided to invade Ukraine just for its resources. If it did, it wouldn't have treated the Ukrainian territory and Ukrainians as it did. I think that the idea was that Ukraine is ours. We have to do it. Yes, it was just assumed that nobody will help and that it will be incorporated just as Crimea was. So that is my impression.
Thank you very much. The gentleman here had his hand up for a while, and then we'll come to you.
Start. I'm going to take you back slightly. I read a commentary recently where it was suggested that at an opportunity,
Yeah, would you?
at an opportunity in the 90s, at a G7 meeting, President Putin asked whether Russia could join NATO. Apparently, the reaction from the Western countries was absolutely shocked. And that's strange because it was at a time when Russia represented absolutely no threat to the West. And in fact, the West were helping to manage nuclear weapons, etc. Why was that opportunity lost?
Well, look, that is a very easy question, I'm afraid. NATO is not so easy to join. Not any country, they say that the gate is open, but not any country can join which has the army and generally speaking, the military machine organized according to the standards of NATO. So it is usually a very difficult process and you need a lot of preparation for it and so on. So of course it was an unexpected offer on Putin's side. I don't think that anybody took it seriously, particularly in view of what Russian army was at that time. It really was completely destroyed. It was destroyed, among other things, by corruption. And what we see now is a bit of a continuation of the same.
Thank you very much. The gentleman over there, could you introduce himself? You have the computer. You have the screen.
Hi, my name is Robin Atson. I am a public administration student at CPT. My question is it worth South Africa and the majority of UN member states to get involved and opposing the Russian conflict against Ukraine? And is it a better option to opt for a two-state resolution as in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, irrespective of the economic impact or the humanitarian impact, with Palestine being a sovereign state, or for this to possibly escalate to even greater conflicts, such as a third world war? And in your opinion, how far do you expect this conflict to escalate?
Yeah.
I don't know how far it is going to escalate. It is really the most tortuous question, not only for me, but for Ukrainians, and I think for most of the Russians, actually. It is very difficult, we don't know. And much depends on Ukrainians and on the Russian army, personally on Putin. The first question about South Africa, it is for South Africans to decide actually what they want and how they see the world, whether it is better for them to say, well, let them sue for peace. Russia has already got a piece of Ukraine, so let them stop and let's leave the rest of Ukraine alone. Maybe that, or whatever resolution that can be worked out, which would be acceptable for Ukraine and for Russia. And that is the problem, you see. What would be acceptable for Ukraine? It's not for South Africa. South Africa may decide and may suggest as many options as possible, but these options have to be acceptable to Ukraine, and they have to be, and Ukraine is after all the victim of the aggression. So that has to be acceptable to Ukraine, and it has to be acceptable to the aggressor as well.
Thank you very much, Irina. Are there any other questions? Roger, Sato, you could just introduce yourself on the computer screen.
Sorry, Roger Sato. There's a lot of talk about crimes against humanity in this, and talk about atrocities. Could you, but some people say, well, this is actually a bit pointless because it's never going to happen. And also it's putting, it's giving no options for Putin to withdraw or anything. It would also seem to me that if you can't enforce it, you're also in some ways weakening the status of international law, which is probably being exploded anyway. Could you give your views on what use, what value is the focus upon the idea of crimes against humanity in this situation?
Roger, I'm not an international lawyer. I'm sorry. I don't know that anybody is going ever to be punished for crimes against humanity, particularly in this war. I very much doubt it. But it's for international lawyers to decide, and to decide not now, but when we see what the future global order is going to be. And it may not be the same as now, it may be absolutely completely different. So.
Thank you. That seems to be wrapping it up, Irina. I just wanted to say, you started by saying the disaster Russia brought on itself is mind-boggling to me, and it's not an easy talk for me, but you nevertheless brilliantly interrogated the whole topic, and thank you so much. Could I just give you a small token of our appreciation?